Glass became, for modern architects, the essential material of the future. Glass was endowed not only with material, visual qualities, but also with spiritual qualities. The German architect Mies van der Rohe would design buildings in America that would become the epitome of glass and steel skyscrapers. But Mies started his work in Germany. In fact, Mies also worked in the office of Peter Behrens when the AEG factory was being designed. And yet, Mies was much more experimental than either Gropius or Behrens. We have photographs of Mies in Behrens' office constructing models of glass skyscrapers and then holding those models against the window in Behrens' office and twisting and turning them to study and experiment with the reflective and refractive qualities of the tall glass building. The kind of amazing moment in architecture. Mies would continue these experiments in two projects for downtown Berlin, one on the Friedrichstrasse and the other on Alexanderplatz. In both of these projects, Mies was looking to see how new building types could be derived that would respond more adequately to the visual potentials of steel and glass and this continuingly emergent technology of steel and glass. But it wasn't until 1954 in New York, in his project for the Seagram Building, where these experiments were first realized in a commercial office tower. The Seagram Building was the administrative headquarters of the Canadian distillery Seagrams, and it was located on Park Avenue in downtown New York. Though the site, of course, is very, very different from the AEG factory, Mies, like Behrens, wanted very much for his building to engage the city and even confront the city with the representational power of architecture in the overall urban fabric. Mies was not working on a corner as Behrens was in the AEG site. He was working mid-block. So he confronted the city in a very different way. He first sets the building back from the street line, creating a fairly deep plaza in front of the building. You don't actually see the Seagram Building as you're coming down Park Avenue. You first see only the gap. According to people that worked with me on the project, that gap in the street line was very important for him. It created a kind of anticipation, a kind of mystery. But as soon as you enter that gap and turn 90 degrees, the slab of the high-rise building confronts you in a very almost aggressively frontal way. The building appears now almost as a pure surface. It's a pure network of steel and glass. So let's look more closely at that surface. The first thing we realize is that while most steel and glass buildings of the time articulate the frame and use the glass as a kind of contrasting transparency to the opacity of the steel frame. In the Seagram's case, the glass is bronzed and the steel is bronzed, and the effect of that homogeneous treatment of the two materials actually bring the materials closer together. Of course, you can still see the articulation of the frame against the glass, but it brings the materials a little bit closer together. It gives the glass at certain angles also a kind of opacity rather than a transparency. The essential thing to be expressed by a high-rise building in steel and glass for Mies is the idea of structure. Of course, the structure of the Seagram's buildings is based on a steel frame. The issue is that because of American building code, the steel cannot be exposed. It cannot even be made visible. The reason is that a steel frame, in the case of fire, of an accidental fire, exposed steel runs the risk of softening and failing structurally. So building codes require that the steel frame be clad in an insulating material, usually concrete. And that's the case at Seagram. Even though it's actually made of a steel frame, the entire steel frame is encased in concrete. So how then do you make the essence of the building, which is structure, how do you make that visible? Mises' solution is to add an additional steel I section. We call it an I section because if you cut through the steel member, its section is shaped like an I. And that I section is laid in a plane in front of the glass. It actually has no structural function whatsoever. It is an ornament, it's an architectural ornament. And yet, as an ornament, as a non-functional element, it represents the structure even more emphatically, if you will, than the structure itself. It's a more true representation of the structure than the structure itself. And this is a very, very interesting development in the idea of architectural ornament. We're a long way from Zimper's knot, but what is similar to Zimper's knot, or the ornament of Zimper's weaving, is its representational function for what is in fact a constructional and structural vocation. This I section in front of the glass is playing the role that in architectural terms we call a mullion. And the series of mullions in front of the glass, because of that one flat plane of the I section, actually creates a virtual plane that is parallel to, but in front of, the glass itself. Visually also, under the right lighting conditions, the mullions cast a shadow on the glass in a very, very similar way, but a much more delicate way than the columns in Barron's AEG factory cast a shadow on the glass. In Mises' case, because of the delicacy of the fabric, the effect that this has is to prevent us in a way from measuring, from calibrating the distance from that virtual plane to the actual plane of glass. And the visual effect of that under the right lighting conditions is a kind of oscillation of the surface. It's as if the surface has a kind of optical depth and an optical movement, or a kind of shimmering that belies the simplicity of the actual architectural elements of the surface. Despite the large amount of glass in the Seagram building and the thinness of the material, the Seagram nevertheless has a kind of corporeality and a presence that's actually very, very dense. Now, part of this is due to the proportions of the slab. The sides of the slab have a sort of 3:5 ratio of width to frontality, and that gives it a kind of chunkiness. But more important, the bronzing of the glass and the metal gives a totality to the surface and a singularity to the surface that also contributes to the visual weight. The bronzing also does one more thing. Bronze actually has a quality of aging, and over time, rather than appearing more and more like a new building, the Seagram has actually taken on an almost archaic quality. Whereas Barron's used the resonance of his building with the Greek temple to insert his building into a continuum of architecture as an art, Mies almost pushes the associations back prior to Greece to some kind of ancient, archaic slab that is older than history itself, even as it's very much part of the present. This haptic plane is completely abstract, but it still has a resonance with the architecture of the past, a grandeur in glass and steel first begun by Peter Behrens.